This is 12 Years a Slave, Chapter 3, Part 2. At last I became silent to his repeated questions. I would make no reply. In fact, I was becoming almost unable to speak. Still, he plied the lash without stint upon my poor body, until it seemed that the lacerated flesh was stripped from bones at every stroke. A man with a practical of mercy in his soul would not have beaten even a dog so cruelly. At length, Radburn said that it was useless to whip me any more, that I would be sore enough. Thereupon Birch desisted, saying, with an admonitory shake of his fist in my face and hissing the words through his firm set teeth, that if I ever dared to utter again that I was entitled to my freedom, that I had been kidnapped or anything whatever of the kind, the castigation I had just received was nothing in comparison with what would follow. He swore that he would either conquer or kill me. With these consolatory words, the fetters were taken from my wrist, my feet still remaining fastened to the ring. The shutter of the little barred window, which had been opened, was again closed, and going out, locking the great door behind them, I was left in the darkness as before. In an hour, perhaps two, my heart leaped to my throat, and the key rattled in the door again. I, who had been so lonely and who had longed so ardently to see someone, I cared not who, now, shuddered at the thought of man's approach. A human face was fearful to me, especially a white one. Radburn entered, bringing with him, on a tin plate, a piece of shriveled fried pork, a slice of bread, and a cup of water. He asked me how I felt, and remarked that I had received a pretty savage flogging. He remonstrated with me against the propriety of asserting my freedom. In rather a patronizing and confidential manner, he gave it to me as his advice that the less I said on the subject, the better it would be for me. The man evidently endeavored to appear kind, whether touched at the sight of my sad condition or with the view of silencing, on my part, any further expression of my rights. It is not necessary now to conjecture. He unlocked the fasteners from my ankles, opened the shutters of the little window, and departed, leaving me again alone. By this time I had become stiff and sore. My body was covered with blisters, and it was with great pain and difficulty that I could move. From the window, I could observe nothing but the roof resting on the adjacent wall. At night, I laid down upon the damp, hard floor without any pillow or covering whatever. Punctually, twice a day, Radburn came in with his pork and bread and water. I had but little appetite, though I was tormented with continual thirst. My wounds would not permit me to remain but a few minutes in any one position. So, sitting, or standing, or moving slowly around, I passed the days and nights. I was heartsick and discouraged. Thoughts of my family, of my wife and children, continually occupied my mind. When sleep overpowered me, I dreamed of them, dreamed I was again in Saratoga, that I could see their faces and hear their voices calling me, awakening from the pleasant phantasms of sleep to the bitter realities around me. I could but groan and weep. Still my spirit was not broken. I indulged the anticipation of escape, and that speedily. It was impossible, I reasoned, that men could be so unjust as to detain me as a slave when the truth of my case was known. Birch, ascertaining I was no runaway from Georgia, would certainly let me go. Though suspicions of Brown and Hamilton were not infrequent, I could not reconcile myself to the idea that they were instrumental to my imprisonment. Surely they would seek me out. They would deliver me from thraldom. Alas, I had not been learned the measure of man's inhumanity to human, nor what limitless extent of wickedness he would go for the love of gain. In the course of several days, the outer door was thrown open, allowing me the liberty of the yard. There I found 3 slaves, one of them a lad 10 years, the other young men of about 20 and 25. I was not long in forming an acquaintance and learning their names and particulars of their history. The eldest was a colored man named Clemens Ray. He lived in Washington, had driven a hack, and worked in a livery stable there for a long time. He was very intelligent and fully comprehended his situation. The thought of going south overwhelmed him with grief. Birch had purchased him a few days before and had placed him there until such time as he was ready to send him to New Orleans Market. From him I learned for the first time that I was in William Slave's pen, a place I had never heard of previously. He described to me the uses for which I was designed. I repeated him the particulars of my unhappy story, but he could only give me the consolation of his sympathy. He also advised me to be silent henceforth on the subject of my freedom, for, knowing the character of Birch, he assured me that it would only attend with renewed whipping. The next eldest was named John Williams. He was raised in Virginia, not far from Washington. Birch had taken him in payment of a debt, and he constantly entertained the hope that his master would redeem him, a hope that was subsequently realized. The lad was a sprightly child that answered to the name of Randall. Most of the time, he was playing about the yard, but occasionally would cry, calling for his mother and wondering when she would come. His mother's absence seemed to be the great and only grief in his little heart. He was too young to realize his condition, and when the memory of his mother was not in his mind, he amused us with his pleasant pranks. At night, Ray, Williams, and the boy slept in the loft of the shed, while I was locked in the cell. Finally, we were each provided with blankets, such as are used upon horses, the only bedding I was allowed to have for 12 years afterwards. Ray and Williams asked me many questions about New York, how colored people were treated there, how they could have been homes and families of their own, with none to disturb and oppress them, and Ray, especially, sighed continually for freedom. Such conversations, however, were not in the hearing of Birch or the keeper Radburn. Aspirations such as these would have brought down the lash upon our backs. It is necessary in this narrative, in order to present a full and truthful statement of all the principal events in the history of my life, and to portray the institution of slavery as I have seen and know it, to have spoken of well-known places, and of many persons who are yet living. I am, and always was, an entire stranger in Washington and its vicinity, aside from Birch and Radburn, knowing no man there except as I have heard of them through my enslaved companions. What I am about to say, if false, can be easily contradicted. I remained in William's slave pen about 2 weeks. The night previous to my departure, a woman was brought in, weeping bitterly, and leading by the hand a little child. They were Randall's mother and half-sister. On meeting them, he was overjoyed, clinging to her dress, kissing the child, and exhibiting every demonstration of delight. The mother also clasped him in her arms, embraced him tenderly, and gazed at him fondly through her tears, calling him by many an endearing name. Emily, the child, was 7 or 8 years old, of light complexion, and with a face of admirable beauty. Her hair fell in curls around her neck, while the style and richness of her dress and the neatness of her whole appearance indicated she had been brought up in the midst of wealth. She was a sweet child indeed. The woman also was arrayed in silk, with rings upon her fingers and golden ornaments suspended from her ears. Her air and manners, the correctness and propriety of her language, all showed evidently that she had sometimes stood above the common level of slave. She seemed to be amazed at finding herself in such a place as that. It was plainly a sudden and unexpected turn of fortune that had brought her there. Filling the air with her complaining, she was hustled, with the children and myself, into the cell. Language can convey but an inadequate impression of the lamentations to which she gave incessant utterance. Throwing upon herself to the floor, and encircling the children in her arms, she poured forth such touching words as only maternal love and kindness can suggest. They nestled closely to her, as if there only was there any safety or protection. At last they slept, their heads resting upon her lap. While they slumbered, she smoothed the hair back from their little foreheads and talked to them all night long. She called them her darlings, her sweet babes, poor innocent things that knew nothing the misery that they were destined to endure. Soon they would have no mother to comfort them. They would be taken from her. What would become of them? Oh, she would not live away from her little Emmy and her dear boy. They had always been good children, and had such loving ways. It would break her heart. God knew, she said, if they were taken from her, and yet she knew they meant to sell them, and maybe they would be separated, and could never see each other anymore. It was enough to melt a heart of stone to listen to the pitiful expressions of that desolate and distracted mother. Her name was Eliza, and this was the story of her, as she afterwards related it. She was the slave of a rich man, living in the neighborhood of Washington. She was born, I think she said, on his plantation. Years before, he had fallen into dissipated habits and quarreled with his wife. In fact, soon after the birth of Randall, they separated. Leaving his wife and daughter in the house they had always occupied, he erected a new one nearby, on the estate. into his house, he brought Eliza, and on condition of her living with him, she and her children would be emancipated. She resided with him for 9 years, with servants to attend upon her and provide with every comfort and luxury of life. Emily was his child. Finally, her young mistress, who had always remained with her mother at the homestead, married a Mr. Jacob Brooks. At length, for some cause, at the guide from her relation, beyond Barry's control, a division of his property was made. She and her children fell to the share of Mr. Brooks. During the 9 years she had lived with Barry, in consequence of the position she was compelled to occupy, she and Emily had become the object of Mrs. Barry and her daughter's hatred and dislike. Barry himself she represented as a man of naturally a kind heart, who always promised her that she should have her freedom, and who, she had no doubt, would arraign it to her then, if it were only in his power. As soon as they came into the possession and control of the daughter, it became very manifest they would not live long together. The sight of Eliza seemed to be odious to Mrs. Brooks. Neither could she bear to look upon the child, half-sister and beautiful as she was. The day she was led into the pen, Brooks had brought her from the estate into the city, under pretense that the time had come when her free papers were to be executed, in fulfillment of her master's promise. Elated at the prospect of immediate liberty, she decked herself and little Emmy in her best apparel and accompanied him with a joyful heart. On their arrival in the city, instead of being baptized into the family of freemen, she was delivered to the trader Birch. The paper that was executed was a bill of sale. The hope of years was blasted in a moment. From the height of most exulting happiness to the utmost depths of wretchedness, she had that day descended. No wonder that she wept and filled the pen with wailings and expressions of heart-rending woe. Eliza is now dead. Far up the Red River, where it pours its waters sluggishly through the unhealthy lowlands of Louisiana, she rests in the grave at last, the only resting place of the poor slave. How all her fears were realized, how she mourned day and night and never would be comforted, how, as she predicted, her heart did indeed break, with the burden of maternal sorrow, will be as the narrative proceeds. That's the end of chapter 3, 12 Years a Slave.